Okay, so I know we have a lot to go through, so let's get this kicked off. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Spectrum and Users, What You Need to Know About the Path to Fixed LTE webinar presented by Telrad Networks. My name is Dory Iran of Eye Opening Marketing, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. We would like to hear from you and would like to include your voice in the conversation. So ask questions, share comments, even challenge our ideas. Use the questions and answers panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player to share at any time during the webinar. We will have a couple poll questions during the webinar. Those will pop up right on your screen, and we'll give you a few seconds to answer each and then share the results. We will also have time for questions at the end. Today's presenter is Tom Gruba, who has over 30 years of experience in telecommunications in various capabilities, including engineering, product management, sales, and marketing. Many of Tom's accomplishments surfaced as he served as Director of Marketing in Alcatel-Lucent's Wireless Infrastructure Division, as Head of Product Marketing at Motorola, and as CMO of their successful Canopy broadband wireless startup. Also presenting today is Steve Coran of the firm Lerman Center. Steve is the chairman of the firm's broadband practice group and serves on its management committee. His practice focuses on the representation of broadband providers, equipment, and technology companies serving their policy, transactional, compliance, and licensing needs. We are proud to have them presenting today. So without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Tom Gruba.
Thanks very much, Dory, and welcome everyone. Today we want to cover some key areas that are hopefully going to clarify things for you as you make decisions about deploying LTE technology and why you want to do that. So the things we're going to cover, the changing in the market, what are the drivers, why has managed spectrum become more and more critical to success, what's the latest, and Chris is going to help us with what's going on with CBRS. Steve is going to help us. And then the affordability of fixed LTE in low density markets, which is a key component of serving those in rural places. So if I talk about the forces of change, spectrum users and apps are what we're going to talk about next, but Dory is going to run a quick poll. We like to take a poll and figure out where everyone is thinking. So as we get started, we get a little visibility into that. So Dory?
Yep, you should be seeing it now, and please go ahead and answer.
We really do appreciate your input into these polls. It helps us understand what is currently top of mind for people, what are the issues, concerns, where are you in the buying process, all of that. So really appreciate your input.
Okay, we're going to give it just a few more seconds. Okay, I'm closing it now.
Very good. So with that, we'll start in, and we're going to talk about user habits and expectations. The fact that unlicensed spectrum, something that has changed in the last few years, are amenable and using unlicensed spectrum. So CBRS hitting the scene, what does that entail, and what does that mean to all of you? And then we look at what's the impact of having LTE products in the fixed market. So let's start with my favorite topic, what's happening with users. I usually start by talking about, well, what are users doing with broadband? And most of you know that video has become more and more of a foothold. And so if you look at the middle section there, the over-the-top devices that most of you are probably familiar with at this point, that in 2010, 4.5% of the households cut the cable, right? They cut the cord, as we say, from eliminating cable. And in 2016, that number had risen to 22%, which represents almost 27 million households. So that is really, really a giant impact to a wireless ISP's business. And if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, we're now talking about, well, what's happening in the home, and that's there are multiple streams per home are now common. And there's stories of people calling up to their service provider saying, hey, I'm not getting the amount you said, the service is not working well. And they're asking questions like, well, are you doing any streaming, any video? And people said no. And in the 2 bedrooms, the son and daughter are both streaming Netflix. So it just shows you that the flexibility of having personal screens and what people are looking for, hungry for, which is video content, that it's creating quite the demand and quite the bandwidth crunch. And that's exacerbated by looking at what's happening with 4K video and how that's going to increase capacity demand over time. So to give you an idea in numbers of what that looked like, Fierce Wireless, P3, and Strategy Analytics do a quarterly apps by volume. They do it predominantly because of the mobile operators. But if you look at the bottom, you'll see what happens on their Wi-Fi component of their devices. And I thought this was a good view to show you what's happening. And this was in Q1 of this year. And you look at it and you see predominated by either video or social like Facebook. And then the pink area there is Chrome browser, which a lot of people are still doing video on, or Netflix. And so we expect Netflix to continue to rise, Facebook Now, Facebook Live, a lot more video. So as you can see, all of that is continuing to drive demand. Now, the problem with that is if you look at this too complex slide, draw your eyes to the right-hand side and the blue circle. If you look over time at the top of the box, you start out with internet where people needed about 25 kilobit per second, average usage per home. That has risen. And currently you're looking at what we understand. Those of you that have a different experience certainly let us know. But average consumption per home is about 2.5 megabits per second. That is on the rise as we talk about additional video streams per house. And if you look to the left, you look at the oversubscription. So if you're offering the package that you see to the left of that, 25 megabit per second package, where we are now is about 10 homes can be offered at 25 megabit per second if each home is average consumption of 2.5 megabits. Now, depending on your sector capacity, that gives you the number of total homes that you could serve, but everyone's got a different amount of spectrum, whether they've got 10 megahertz, 20 megahertz, etc. So right now I just focused it on what is the package size that you're offering and how many homes can you serve if those people are using 25 megabits, if they're using 2.5 megabits per second. And you can see that as you go down to the next row, that if people's consumption rises, the number of homes at that package is going to decline. So the trend is you're serving fewer users per sector as that average climbs. The concern is, how do you get users to pay more? And then the third, you've got to figure out a way to add capacity and get users to pay more. And you can add capacity by doing one of two things, either changing the technology or by using additional spectrum, or of course, both. So if we talk about the how do we get users to pay more problem, if you look at an offering out there today, just like I do, you look at it and they say, well, we give you 15 megabit per second best effort. Nobody understands what best effort is. So that's the first problem. So one of the things that we've talked about is, well, people understand their water faucets because it's in their house, it's a daily experience. And you say, well, what's the pressure like at one faucet? And everyone looks at you and says, well, yeah, it's great. But what happens if you turn on every faucet in the house? And then they start to understand that as you have more demand within the house, you're providing the pipe in, but how you're using it is going to impact the experience at every faucet. Okay, so key factors in overcoming the challenges is that type of education so they understand it. And I talked to a few people at Wispapalooza where they're actually starting to change the packages. And instead of offering a 15 meg or 25 meg package, which most of us don't understand, they're now looking at how many simultaneous video streams do you want to support? 1? You want 3? You want 4? What do you want? And then you look at having a charge based on the package size in a currency that they understand. So that's something to consider. In terms of the technology, you look at the equipment, and you want equipment that's software scalable. And software scalable means it's a software-defined radio, and over-the-air software updates provide additional capacity with no truck roll. That's, of course, what we're going to talk about here later with LTE. And then, of course, selecting the right spectrum to reduce interference, because interference robs capacity. So now we're talking about managed spectrum at 3 gigahertz or possibly 2.5 gigahertz. And we'll talk about the financial impacts of that. The other problem is, how do you surgically increase network capacity to keep up with that demand? So in other words, can I go in and I've got a crowded sector or a crowded site where I need to increase demand or increase capacity. How do I do that? So Telrad has capacity features that have a number of different ways to add capacity to your network. First, there's carrier aggregation, which concatenates two separate and distinct channels into one. And if you look at bullet number 2, the result of being able to combine or concatenate those two channels is you get more speed as a result, right? More throughput speed. It's done through a software update, so that's the good news. It's a 3GPP standard feature, so those of you that are not familiar with 3GPP is the one that writes the standards for the mobile industry. And the good news is they need capacity more than anyone, so they're always driving the capacity features for LTE forward. That's great news. Second in the list here is multi-user MIMO. It increases the spectral efficiency, and basically what that means is I'm getting more bits per hertz. And being able to do that means I'll be able to serve more users at that same site. And what's required there is a 4 transmit, 4 receive radio. Sometimes it's called a 4x4 radio. And that's what you're getting from Telrad right out of the box. We don't even sell a 2x2 radio because we know it would have a limited life expectancy on a tower. And then the third feature is dual sector. And so dual sector allows you to use that 4x4 radio with using 2 different chunks of spectrum, but being able to direct them in 2 different directions. So this is a great way to start in an area with lower CapEx, serving more users, and get your business going and grow from there. So let's talk about what's happening with spectrum. 2 things that are the challenges: more companies requiring spectrum. And if you think about it, years ago, there was a limited number of people that use spectrum, but now with IoT and all kinds of additional wireless devices, the demand is huge. The second challenge is that the noise floor rise is diminishing capacity in unlicensed bands, 5 gigahertz. When I started with Motorola Canopy in 2002, 2.4 gigahertz was a very popular band. The noise floor rose, it drove everyone to 5 gig. And now what you're seeing is years later, and especially with the advent of the mobile carriers using unlicensed spectrum for LTE and LAA, the noise floor is rising, which will diminish capacity. So the demand for spectrum has changed because it used to be, like I said, few people, TV, radio, military. Now you have this myriad of different organizations that are all vying for spectrum, and that creates a supply-demand problem. So my message to all of you is, if you haven't looked at acquiring 365 or 25, or you need help doing it, then let us know, because once it's gone, and now you have business risk. So in terms of unlicensed spectrum, like I said, you have not only LTE and LAA, so LTE is unlicensed, LAA is license assisted access, which uses a licensed channel, so it's a frequency that the mobile operators currently own, but then the payload path is through 5 gigahertz, and then most of you have probably heard of multi-fire. So as there's growth and as there's pressure on 5 gigahertz, that noise floor rises, and the problem is that it brings in business risk to all of you. And then people tell me, well, not in rural, Tom, right? I said, well, no, rural doesn't mean low population density. I grew up in rural Illinois, but the town was 35,000 people, and that's a market, and it's a big enough market to attract Sprint, Verizon, AT&T, and the others. So the impact of a noising rise floor, we talk about it in terms of SINAR, that signal to interference to the noise ratio. And the problem is that number gets lower as it declines. The radios that are designed to use 256 QAM or some of these higher modulation techniques, they can't tolerate that. They can't resolve the signal at that low SINAR. And so what happens is, it's like I tell people, if you're at a party and you're the first ones at the party, I can talk to you from across the room in a very low voice. But as that party gets more and more packed with people, you've got to be right next to the person, and you've got to be basically yelling in their ear to be heard. So the radio works the same way. So the impact is you have no guaranteed capacity. Therefore, licensed spectrum becomes business imperative. And so, of course, look at your own service areas. If you're an operator, determine if there's risk in your area, how much risk, what's that going to do to your business. So investigating these two frequencies, as I said, is what action you'd want to take. So at this point, I'm going to bring Steve in because I want Steve to talk about the latest and greatest of what's going on with the CBRS. So Steve, take it away.
Well, thanks, Tom, and nice to be able to participate on the webinar. Let me kind of just go through a couple of the license bands that are and have been available in some respects to wireless ISPs. The 2.5 gigahertz spectrum band is available, but only in limited areas. Sprint has captured through long-term leases the vast majority of the spectrum. It is possible to find expiring leases. It is possible to find unleased locations. Got to hunt around for them, and you have to know how to do it. But there may be opportunities and to do some sort of a fixed play using LTE in the 2.5 gigahertz band. Obviously, with a 35-mile geographic service area, you enjoy the full benefits of not just protection, but exclusivity, which enables you to offer service level agreements to business customers with confidence. Also, if you get a long-term lease, you do have sort of built-in financing for that, which is something different than what you would get from having to purchase other spectrum bands or do secondary market transactions if you're fortunate enough to do those. So some benefits there. The costs are probably a little bit higher when it comes to obviously when you compare it to unlicensed, but a very good band if you can find spectrum in your area. In the 3 gigahertz Citizens Broadband Radio Service, CBRS, many of you I'm sure use 3.65 to 3.7 today, and the FCC adopted rules a couple of years ago in 2015 that would make available on a commercial basis shared spectrum in the 3550 to 3650 megahertz band. There's 3 tiers of use in that band. There's incumbent uses, which is the Navy along the coast and Army radar at various bases around the country, as well as some earth stations similar but at different locations to what you have in 365. That's the incumbent tier. The priority access licensing tier provides protected use against all other users except for those in the incumbent tier. These are 10 megahertz licenses, and the FCC will probably be conducting an auction, I want to say in probably 2019. And then the third tier is general authorized access, which is similar to unlicensed, but there's a registration requirement in what's called the Spectrum Access System, which is which governs this 3-tiered hierarchy and takes care of any potential interference among priority access license users in the second tier and facilitates coordination among GAA users, which are in the third tier. This is a kind of our first example, our first experiment with automated and dynamic spectrum sharing. There is a multi-stakeholder group called the Wireless Innovation Forum that is working every day to develop protocols, algorithms, policies for this spectrum access system. You spend a couple of hours with those guys and you realize that engineering is not a pure science. It's occupying, as I said, a lot of time as we build this thing from the ground up. The SAS, the Spectrum Access System, will be managed by a number of private contractors, not the FCC. One thing to keep in mind is that the FCC has recently reopened some of these licensing rules. Right now, the priority access licenses will be auctioned on a census tract basis. There are 74,000 census tracts, and there will be 7 licenses, so that's 520 some odd thousand licenses. And the licenses are for 3-year terms with 1 3-year renewal that you can purchase at the first auction. The mobile industry has come in and asked the FCC to change those rules to go to much larger areas, something called partial economic areas. There's 416 of those. So if you do a little math, for every one PEA, partial economic area, you have 178 census tracts. And I've also asked the FCC to have 10-year licenses that are renewable. And the threat to those in the WISP industry, industrial IoT, neutral hosts, and private venues is that these areas are much too large and will be much too expensive for many of us to purchase. So the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, WISPA, which I represent, a number of the members, vendors, and others that are not within the WISP community are working together to try to push back on those rules. If you do want more information, there is some information on the wispa.org webpage that explains this in more detail. And if this is a band that you care about, as you should, we urge your assistance in the effort in writing comments and doing social media and otherwise just being aware. We expect the comments will be due sometime towards the end of next month. We're waiting for the 30-day clock to start. Finally, there's also additional spectrum in the mid-band. The slide here says 3.7 to 3.8, but it actually goes all the way up to 4.2. So there's 500 megahertz of spectrum that is in play at the FCC. Microsoft in particular has suggested that 3.7 to 3.8 part of the band, the lower 100 megahertz of this 500 megahertz, be allocated to CBRS. Part of the reason is because you have LTE band 42, which goes from 3,400 to 3,600 megahertz. And you have LTE band 43 that goes from 3,600 to 3,800. So this would be another full LTE band that right now is sort of cut in half. What you do with the rest of the 400, or actually the whole 500, is something the FCC is considering, whether it's the same spectrum approach or something that's a little bit different. WISPA and others have suggested that the FCC do something like a Part 101 frequency coordination for fixed. The mobile industry obviously wants their hands on this because the mobile industry strategy is, when it comes to spectrum, our motto is always more. So that's what I have on spectrum. And Tom, I'll turn it back to you. And I guess we'll take questions at the end if they come up. Thanks.
Great. So if I look at the very last bullet, the key takeaway for all of you making equipment decisions is that the Telrad radio works across the entire band, which is why it's up to 3.8. So it's a tunable radio. It's tunable over 300 megahertz with a radio head that serves 40 megahertz at any one time. That's the important part that you want to know if you're doing product selection. So if I move into how much the spectrum cost, this information came from Wireless 2020. It is not hard and fast. It is just to give you a general idea, because what I hear is, oh, we can't afford to have spectrum in our business case. Well, if you look at it, if you're thinking that mobile is your framework and you understand how expensive licenses are for mobile, then if you look at 2.5, and on the left-hand side in the circle, you see it was about $1 a megahertz pop. But if you're using it for fixed, it's about 35 cents. Now that's a general. I've heard of people paying a lot less for that. And below that, you see 3.5 for CBRS if you're doing PAL, because it's a slightly higher frequency. I think the expectation from Wireless 2020 was, well, it's a higher band. It's not quite as effective as 2.5. Therefore, it'll be worth a little less. How much less? Probably a nickel. Now, that's a general guideline just to give you something to use in your business case.
Hey, Tom, Steve, there was a question that came through. How do you apply for CBRS licenses, and when are the PAL auctions?
So the PAL auction will be probably sometime in 2019. The FCC has 2 other auctions that they want to do first, at least 2 other auctions. And they also lack authority right now from Congress to collect auction proceeds. So that's a problem that should take care of itself pretty quickly. The way you will apply is you will submit a short form application that will identify the markets that you want to submit bids on. There will be a reserve price. Beyond that, the auction rules have not been proposed yet, but things to look out for are things like package bidding, where you can say, I want to bid on all 10 of these licenses, or I don't want any of them. Things like bidding credit. So if you're in a rural area or you're a small business, should you be entitled to some sort of a bidding credit? But these are all things we don't yet know.
Thank you, Steve. So if we look at this slide, as I said, the Telrad radio is a tunable radio across 300 megahertz. In this case, I talked about the 250 megahertz of known 3 gigahertz spectrum, what we know is going to happen today. But of course, as Steve pointed out, there are changes afoot. Carrier aggregation is a key feature. If you're not familiar with it, what it does, it takes 2 different carriers and then brings them in and concatenates them. And those 2 carriers could be anywhere in the band. So if you're looking at, gee, what kind of product do I buy that is best going to serve me for the longest period of time on the tower, you want the flexibility that you can be anywhere within that 300 megahertz. The second piece, which is the second bullet, is not only is it tunable across 300 megahertz, but what you want is a wideband radio, and that is how much of the spectrum can actually serve by delivering capacity. So it's a 40 megahertz radio, and it can be used in different combinations. So carrier aggregation, it could be 20 by 20. Right now it's capable. The software is being worked on. We're probably going to have an announcement on that very soon. But 20 by 20 means I can take 2 20 megahertz channels and concatenate them. And currently we're doing it with 2 10 by 10s. What this really means to all of you is investment protection, right? So for those of you that own a business, you sleep better at night knowing that you've got a lot of flexibility.
We have one more question regarding the 3.65 spectrum.
Yeah.
If we don't currently have any spectrum in 3.65, is there a way to get some for testing?
Well,
yes.
Go ahead, Tom. Do you want to take that one, Tom?
Yeah, and then I'll let you backfill me.
Sure.
So there's a couple ways there, and Steve will probably talk about how to get test spectrum. But we sent out an email recently that said, what to do if you have 365 licenses, what to do if you don't have it. There were people that contacted us that have 365 licenses that are willing to sell them. So if you contact us, we'll put you in touch with those people or help you with that so that you could actually get spectrum. In terms of the test, can you get a test license? I'm going to let Steve answer that.
So we've been, there have been a number of folks, some who have 365 and some who don't, who have wanted to trial equipment and do a market trial in 3550 to 3650, which is the CBRS band. And we've been successful in getting a number of those. We have a number that are pending at the FCC and others that are backed up here at our office that we're working on. And many of these have been our Telrad equipment trials. And people are interested in comparing propagation to other things they're using. They want to try larger channels. They want to do some budgeting for purposes of how much they might want to spend on a PAL in a particular area. They might be in a rural area that's part desert, part city, part forest, and want to compare propagation within the network. The one word of caution I would say is in recent days, even the FCC has been giving a little bit of a pushback on the scope of these trials, and want to make sure that they're not just replicating your existing network and essentially expanding, getting a head start on the rules and doing kind of a full-scale deployment. So I've been urging people when they do their trials to kind of think of what the scope that they really need to do to learn what they want to learn, as opposed to turning it into a soft launch in the band. So we've been doing quite a bit of that and working with WISPs all over the country to secure those licenses. So happy to help you, and we appreciate Telrad's support in helping with the application and putting their equipment in the field and putting it to the test.
Very good. Thank you, Steve. Just some quick takeaways. If you're managing a business, you're looking for the maximum time on the tower. Having a software-defined radio and one that has the key attributes listed here, it should be an important component of your decision. And let me just say that we work very well with unlicensed and licensed together. Cats and dogs living together. It's a wonderful thing. So I'm not saying don't look at unlicensed. I'm looking at, the reason you want to look at LTE is standards-based, non-line of sight. Uses a managed or licensed band for protection. So those are the reasons that all combined are why it's a great add to what you might already have. So let's now talk about why fixed LTE. And I think with that, we have another survey for you, if you don't mind.
Yes, we do. Let me launch that now.
And again, I can't stress enough how important it is to get your feedback and input. We talk about and work with customers on LTE and what Steve's talking about in terms of CBRS and the spectrum, but you guys are typically the boots on the ground running the businesses, and so your input is vital to our success and understanding what we need to be doing.
Okay, I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. And I'm closing now. Let's see the results.
Great. So in terms of the polling results, 24% are not sure there's a business case. I'd love to talk to you folks because there certainly is. Acquiring spectrum will kill my business. That's part of the business case. So very interesting. I would be delighted to have more discussions around that. 19% don't know which vendor to choose. So hopefully when we talk about the benefits here, it helps clarify that. And if not, then we need to talk about the additional components. And then the value of not sure what value fixed LTE brings to them. All of those they're great in terms of understanding where you are. It looks like a pretty even split between the 45% of you that did indeed vote. Let's move on for why fixed LTE, which should answer a couple of the questions you had there. So what is really great is that you know that WISPA released the report and made it public, and that was the one by the Carmel Group, and you'll see at the bottom, you know, that was commissioned by WISPA. And the key takeaway points were that the ARPU range for broadband wireless providers is that 70% are getting over $40 a month, with 23% of that 70% in the range of $51 to $60 per month. That's pretty good stuff. And if you look at 27% of that 69%, that's getting over $60 a month. That is a terrific business. That's why I've bumped into former Motorola colleagues that are in private equity. They're looking because they realize that those of you in the fixed wireless business is a very good business. Key component, another component of why it's a good business is because churn is very minimal. If you're serving your customers well, they typically don't have an alternative. They'll love you to death for providing something that they couldn't do otherwise. And 67% are in less than 1% range. So that's just terrific. Subscriber acquisition costs, that range is 200 to 400. I'm always a big fan of how to actually bring that acquisition cost down, but I don't know exactly what was included in that acquisition cost. Growth, so 57%, a healthy percent, reported over 11% per year annual growth, which is a terrific growth metric. And then, of course, at our seminars, we also talk about the CAF opportunity, Connect America Fund, which is being done these days as a reverse auction. So that's an opportunity to get government money to serve those unserved areas. If we talk about the top reasons why LTE makes sense for fixed, so for those of you that answered, you're not sure how it would provide it, there's business generation and business protection. If I look at the top box, it's non-line of sight. And that really translates into more market share per tower, which in effect reduces your cost per subscriber. It also enables the ability to offer service level agreements to serve those business customers that are probably going to pay higher ARPU than others. That's because you're using a licensed band or a managed band to be able to do so, and your risk of interference therefore is much less. So it's not going to rob all of your capacity. There's exit strategy value. So a lot of people will say, you know, I want to grow the business up, but I want to exit out for retirement. And the people I talk about is if you have a stand-based product as your network, then they will give you a value for the network. For those people that have a proprietary network, they're paying you for the subscribers that you have, and they look at the equipment as something they're going to have to replace, so they value that at zero. Loans are easy to come by. One example of a very large customer of ours said that when he used to go to banks and try to describe this, they didn't understand what they were talking about. Now he walks in and says it's LTE, and he says, pick up your phone. You see that LTE? That's what we're talking about. So he said, actually, loans are a lot easier to come by. And then a scalable architecture. So LTE, because it's standards-based and is a scalable architecture because it was driven by mobile operators, is it scales up very nicely. And Telrad has helped keep some of the components that were higher cost components like the EPC into now a very manageable fixed price, or I should say a scalable price, in line with what you need to be as an operator out in the unserved and underserved areas. From a business protection, we're talking about a capacity roadmap that's driven by those top mobile operators. That's what drives the standards. That's what said, here's how we're going to increase capacity. So it's not one company trying to determine, am I going to put the investment here for R&D or over there? They're always looking for those top box capacity feature adds. Lots of manufacturers, so those of you that don't think about it or haven't thought about it in a while, as a standards-based product, you have choice. So you don't have to worry about one company going out of business and taking you down. It's LTE has a lot of different vendors out there providing products. Of course, because it has been used for mobile networks, the carrier-grade reliability and performance is a key component. So this is a product that actually has high 9 availability, reliability, and mean time between failure. And that, of course, is part of what Telrad does because it's a purpose-built access point or eNode B instead of using some other off-the-shelf or more common cost-effective parts. If we look at the last component that I think is important to anyone's business case is the available talent pool. LTE has been around long enough that there are lots of trained engineers, and if you're looking for people to understand it, they understand the technology, whether it's mobile or fixed. Sure, there's some differences between manufacturers, but between the two, they understand the basics of LTE, and you can get up and running and find people that can help you with your network. So if we now look at the ecosystem at CBRS, I think we did a pretty good job of covering this in terms of CBRS, but key components is under bullet number 2, where it says capacity rule of thumb. Regardless of what people tell you, look at a simple metric that says, what is the number of bits per hertz that we're going to get? The best you can do these days using the different antenna technologies is 5.5 bits per hertz. So if you're looking at a 10 megahertz channel, you multiply it up, you'd be the best possible case would be 55 megabits. So non-LTE solutions to get that kind of bit rate end up using much larger channels to provide that bit rate. So when you're looking at spectrum and paying for spectrum and your spectrum options, you're looking at how many bits per hertz am I going to get for the spectrum available. So it's not an easy comparison of saying I had 40 megahertz and unlicensed, I only get 10 here. It's going to be much worse. That's not necessarily true. And because of the way that CBRS is set up, when you request channels in GAA, you may not get contiguous channels. And that's why, again, understanding carrier aggregation and being able to have a product that aggregates them wherever they are in that band is going to be important to your business decision. We'll move on from there. So in terms of your goals and challenges, when we talk about it and understanding, are these your goals and challenges? I think so. So increasing market share per tower. What are the tools you need to do that? You need non-line of sight capability and capacity. That's column number 3 under the tools. If you go back to the left, in terms of extending the life of deployed assets, what are the tools? Field upgradable, extendable products, over-the-air software, and having a capacity roadmap that makes your existing platform that much more effective for the long term. Being able to offer higher value services to businesses. And this is where if you spend more time looking at our portfolio and not just the radio, that's where we start talking about the layer 2 business features that we have and being able to serve business customers to meet the goals that they want to do. So if they want to eliminate a lease line, we're able to help them do that. The other component is if you're using managed spectrum, it reduces your service level agreement risk. So either customers, operators have not been offering a service level agreement because it's been unlicensed, or they didn't sleep well at night doing so. So having a managed spectrum or licensed spectrum is going to afford you the opportunity to serve those business customers. Several of our customers, Red Zone for one, we'll talk to you about that at length. And then increasing business value. One of the things that I really like is the flexibility of our 4x4 radio. In a future slide here, there's 6 different deployment scenarios. And one of those scenarios starts you with lower startup cost. So you buy the radio as a 2x2 radio, software license is up, but it's really you're deploying a 4x4 radio that you could actually use to serve 2 sectors, or if you want to license it for a single sector because you want to try marketing in a new area. Our goal is to make sure that you're successful in your business, because if your business grows, our business grows. It's as simple as that. So why Telrad for LTE? So higher market share per tower, so that's the non-line of sight capability. Cost per sub that works in low density situations. Those are some of those deployment scenarios that I'm talking about. So if you want to understand that in more detail, we'd be thrilled to help you with that and understand why it will work for you. Leverage capital efficiency. So if you think about being able to deploy that radio in different configurations, you can deploy more radios in more situations with less capital. And then as you want to convert it into a higher capacity radio, you start adding, but you already have cash flow coming in. So the next component is, if we have all of these different software features to increase capacity, you're going to rip and replace less often. So it is not a fair comparison to say, well, how much is an LTE radio? It's X dollars. Oh, that's more than an unlicensed radio. True, but if our radio stays on the tower twice as long as an unlicensed or proprietary radio, then you've got to make that comparison given what pain you go through to do a rip and replace and the ease at which you can do software upgrades using software. And then the bottom one here is talking about the higher value services to meet the needs of business customers, which is a great target for any business. And then being able to offer a carrier grade service level agreement, right? That typically results in higher revenue. And to meet the needs of those business customers, we talk about features that Telrad themselves developed. They're not part of the standards because the mobile standard doesn't go that far, but in terms of providing a fixed service to customers, you need to have these layer 2 features. LTE itself addresses layer 3, not layer 2. And so there's things like NAT and double natting and all the things that you want to avoid. There's layer 2 bridging at the CPE. It's often preferred in a fixed deployment because, like I said, you want to avoid double natting. It's important for different gamers and businesses. If you want to do things like remove leased lines, then you need the type of features here that are going to provide a replacement or alternative to that business. And then 3GPP doesn't really define static IP because that's not their world, but Telrad did. So we've got all these different ways to help you run the business. So it goes beyond the radio, but it does make sure that we're putting you with the right components as a fixed only manufacturer to serve the customers that you want to serve to make money. Some of our customers here, Red Zone is in Maine. You get others that like Whisper Internet is in Southern Illinois. So we've got a good collection. This is just a small component of the customers that we have. They've been in business since we started deploying LTE in 2015, and the list of customers grows. We'd like you to join them. As we talk about the different options, I won't go through this in detail, but we have this slide, and at a time we can talk about it in more detail. But just notice that in the upper left-hand corner, you can start with low density deployments, so it's a lower cost of capital, and you move through the different paths. I'm not saying you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but you can select which of these scenarios best works for you. So if you pick number 5 and look at it, you've got a maximum peak rate. So there's a solution for that. If you want the maximum non-line of sight penetration, you'd be picking number 4. Number 3 looks at it and says, hey, I want to use one radio, but I want to be able to do dual sectors. So I'll have 2 different chunks of spectrum and be able to use it, one chunk in one sector and one in another. So this is the flexibility and the power of having one radio that you got to keep in the truck. So when you go to deploy, you're always using the same radio, and then you upgrade it with software for the different capabilities that you want, so that it stays, once you deploy it, it's going to be very flexible to meet your needs. If you look at the entire solution, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is actually providing an end-to-end solution, a complete solution, all the way through the middle portion there where you talk about the EPC. That's the Evolved Packet Core. So in LTE, you have to have an Evolved Packet Core. One is for signaling, and the other is the packet gateway that gets everybody out to the internet. And that has been typically a very, very expensive component in mobile networks because mobile networks are typically very large. What Telrad did is a very clever way of creating two solutions. One is we embed the EPC in the radio itself, so it's localized. It can be either local at the tower or local inside the radio. One of the advantages of having it that far out is that if you end up using wireless backhaul or having backhaul that might be just a little bit flaky, and for LTE, the timing is very sensitive for LTE, so flaky doesn't have to be a lot of flaky, but if that occurs, other manufacturers have the problem where the users, they get dropped and their session gets lost, and they have to re-authenticate and reestablish a session. When your EPC is localized, you don't have to do that. In addition, we have also provided for the opportunity of a centralized EPC. So if you want to have centralized, it works in conjunction with the local EPCs, or it can be centralized, and so you've got high capacity. So lots of different flexibility here. And of course, the EPC also does things like AAA and also your third-party HSS. And for some of those, the billing and authentication, you see a couple companies we work with there, Sonar and Azatel. To the right-hand side of the picture, you talk about CPE management. Telrad has broken through a hurdle, and that was we combined layer 2 and layer 3 to actually be able to provide stats on CPE all the way to the individual device, which makes troubleshooting and reduces truck rolls in a big way. Others haven't even figured this out. Some of the very large LTE customers that are mobile don't understand that in a fixed network, you need to have this type of capability. Those of you that operated fixed networks certainly understand the value of understanding what's going on at each individual CPE. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of the breadth of the solution that we have to offer. So I think just about conclusion here. Why Telrad today? We've got more fixed license experience than anyone else. We went through the hurdles of WiMAX, understanding OFDM technology, and LTE is OFDM-A technology. So we've had years of experience in it. We provide better ROI in more situations, given that it's a software-defined radio. It's a purpose-built radio that gives better performance. And when I say better performance, I mean, at the edges, at the cell boundaries. And a purpose-built radio, you're looking at really how do I squeeze the maximum number of bits out of the bandwidth, out of the spectrum that I have. And then the third component is what we just covered a slide ago, which is providing the breadth of the portfolio. So it's not incumbent upon you to have to figure out solutions for yourselves. We've got a lot of these solutions worked out or can integrate with what you already have. So just to give an idea of how we like to connect with prospects and with customers, webinars, certainly doing events, and then seminars, which are typically one-day events in person. We do presentations, Steve's there, I'm there. And what we look at doing is providing a day overview, bring in some customers, bring in outside experts to talk about it. We typically do those alongside an event. And in 2018, our event list will be very similar to what it was this year, with the addition of increasing the number of telco events that we go to in 2018. So if you want to come out and see us, the next seminar will be in Miami. Not a bad place to be if you're like me in Chicago. January 24th is a wonderful time to get to Miami, and that's where Dory lives, and so she tells me it is absolutely spectacular. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending today, and we'll open it up for some questions.
So we definitely have some questions here. Can you go back a couple of slides, Tom? There were some clarifications on some of the abbreviations that you had on the product slide. I think some people needed clarification on things like EPC, AAA, HSS.
Okay, so EPC is Evolved Packet Core, and the Evolved Packet Core in the architecture, you have the eNode Bs, they connect to an Evolved Packet Core, which has two components, has the serving gateway and a packet gateway. If you look up and do a quick Google search, you'll see many different architecture drawings because it's a standard, they're all the same. But what that does is, if you look down here on internet, so the packet gateway gets you to the internet, and then the serving gateway does the the communication between the radios and the network. And then with your AAA is your authentication. And the third-party HSS is for billing. I'm forgetting the acronym now, but is the billing components to be able to make sure that you get paid, which is always good. So AAA, we have a product, Breeze Radius, but of course, a lot of people already have their own AAA authentication platforms. So those are.
So just to add to that, for those of you who don't know LTE, some of the abbreviations you're seeing on here are the LTE speak. So when you're saying eNode B, it basically means the base station. When you see UE, it means the CPE or the unit that's at the customer premises.
Yeah, thank you, Dory.
No
That's a
problem.
great point.
Okay, a couple other questions. So someone was asking for a little bit of clarification on the 3.65 license. They say that their license says that it is valid in the entire US. So can you explain?
Yes.
Sure. Licenses for 365 to 3.7 are nationwide non-exclusive licenses, and that gives you the right to go to the FCC and register individual base and fixed locations. You're allowed to continue during this transitional period between where we are now under the rules and where we will be under the CBRS rules when 365 is combined into that. You do need to register locations and have the FCC approve them, and you can do that through the FCC's universal licensing system.
Thank you. Can you briefly describe the components that make up your network management and monitoring portfolio?
I think, Dory, we have two components. We have a CPE view, and the other is Breeze View Management.
Correct.
Yes. So those are the two components. And I have not worked as extensively with those two, but I know that the guys in the field talk about them at length because it's so important as a troubleshooting device and to understand what's going on in your network. So those are built from the ground up to make sure that an important component, which is visibility into your network, is as good as we can make it.
What training is provided?
So we do training classes in Kentucky. So we offer classes there to get the technical people up to speed. And one of the things that Telrad does is we're very liberal with our support policy. So we do whatever it takes to get a customer up and running. And what could be phone time. And there's times we've actually had to send a body out to the field. But we'll go to any extent because we're only fixed wireless. We're only serving customers like you. And we're dedicated to making sure that we get it up and running. And like any new technology, there's always problems. It's how well you handle the problems that really matters. And so if you talk to our customers, you'll know that Telrad does everything in their power to fix it and get it up and running. So we're also looking at some additional training. So I've actually just talked to someone that I'd worked with previously into coming in and even extending our training program more extensively. So it will do things that brings us all the way from people that don't quite have the same knowledge base or skill set in LTE or even wireless. And then of course you have to understand IP. So we're looking at being able to extend it to help operators bring their people up to speed that much faster.
Thank you. If Sprint owns 2.5 gigahertz and the 3.65 auction rules are not determined yet, how can an operator get comfortable running a test with Telrad and 3.65?
Tom, do you want that one or you want me to take it?
Start with the Sprint owns some of the 2.5. So there's two chunks of 2.5. There's the Sprint piece, and then there's the educational band, EBS band. So 2.5 is out there. The 3.65, as you know, are those licensed. Obviously, be out testing, and when you register the products, you'll understand whether operators in the area, and that's how you coordinate the spectrum. So Steve, what can you add to that?
Just that it's important to remember that 365 is the license service now, and 355 to 365 is where the trials are being conducted. So that's it's 2.5 is an already robust license service. It's been around since the 1970s, and it's been repurposed a number of times, from things like wireless cable to fixed wireless to whatever Sprint is going to be doing with it next, which appears to be some sort of a mobile LTE build out that it's working on. But LTE is LTE, and we in the fixed community benefit from all the good work that the International Standards Body has done, primarily for the benefit of their mobile customers.
Great. And if that didn't answer the question, then please ask it again, and maybe we'll make sure that we get it right.
Someone is saying that they need help launching their business in Houston. I guess Tom, we would say that we'll definitely contact them afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Make sure that we get the name and number, and we'll get right on that.
Okay. Another question. I would like to know, what is the max number of CPEs I can connect with one base station?
Maximum number of CPE. Well, we need Nick Dewar here. I think we're at 256. I believe that's the right number. And I'd be interested in understanding why that's an important component to people, because typically with the capacity being sold today, it's not a number of connections problem, it's how much capacity do I have. So 256 is a lot of connections for fixed wireless out of one sector, but I'd love to hear more about maybe the application slightly different. And so someone's looking at doing something like IoT, where you may need a lot more devices hanging off the network than you would for, say, households or businesses.
So coming off of that, there's another question that is asking about that capacity. What is your current capacity throughput in 3.65?
So if you take 10 megahertz and multiply it by the 5.5 bits per hertz, that's what you'll get. As you go to multi-user
Tom, I'm not sure if it's just my computer, but I think that we can't hear you for some reason.
Right, I can't hear either.
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
Sorry, I had a lag in my service. So if I recap, it was 5.5 bits per hertz, and if you've got 10 megahertz, 20 megahertz, 40 megahertz of spectrum, you still multiply by 5.5. And if you get to multi-user MIMO, it's going to increase the bits per hertz efficiency, and you go from 5.5 to what they say is 10. 10 is very aggressive. It's lab-based, right? What happens? But in effect, you almost double your capacity with multi-user MIMO. I would look at that more as you get a 50% increase in capacity with multi-user MIMO.
What is the minimum height of tower needed for deployment?
That's a great question. Usually that's engineered based on the angle that you want to get. So if you had line of sight, you can have a very low tower. But as you have a lot of trees, what you want to try to do is you don't want to go straight through trees. You want to be high enough up where you're catching edges of trees and things and using the reflections to actually improve the signal. So I don't have any concrete numbers for you. We need to know a little bit more of the situation, but it's not hundreds of feet up, right? You may need 100 feet up or 75 feet up, but we can get, if you capture that question, we can get Nick Dewar and the engineering team to actually provide good guidance on that.
Where can you check to see who owns 2.5 gigahertz in your area?
Well, you could look at the FCC's database, but it's not going to, and do a geographic search, but that will only tell you part of the story, because a lot of the stations that appear to be available for lease may in fact be leased, because before January 2005, leases did not have to be recorded in the FCC's database. So you may see stuff that looks like it's leased and it actually isn't. So, and vice versa. So those are things that, you know, if that's something you're interested in, we can help you out with.
Thanks. Okay. When Tom said 5.5 bit per second per hertz, does he mean 5.5 megabit per second?
No, I mean, you get 5.5 bits. So you get 5.5 bits per hertz. So if you had 10 megahertz, you're getting 5.5 times 10 or 55 megabits per second.
Okay, so there are still a couple of questions I see coming in, but we've already gone over. For anyone who didn't get their questions answered, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll also try to go through
Dory,
after the fact. Yeah.
Dory, can we keep going for anyone that wants to stay on and answer questions?
Sure.
Awesome, that'd be great. So anyone that wants to stay on, I'm happy to stay. And Steve, if you've got a minute or two.
I have a couple minutes. I'm due on a call now, but I can join that one a little late.
Okay.
Okay, let me go find these questions.
Yeah, sorry, Dory.
Sure. So as a follow-up to the 3.65, there's a question, will all the sites we have registered be grandfathered in when the CBRS changes happen?
Answer is no, and there was a deadline of August 7 to go to the FCC's database and grandfather those locations that were subject to grandfathering, and you would have had to have constructed and placed in operation by April 16th of 2016, those sites that are eligible for grandfathering, and certify that they're in operation and you're in compliance with FCC rules. So it wasn't available just to anybody that registered, and it's not available for any sites registered after that April date in 2016.
And someone just needs clarification. I know you mentioned it before, Steve, but when do you think the FCC will decide on the 3.65 rules?
Well, I think they're going to decide on it sometime in the first quarter of 2018, but we have to go through comments and reply comments and a lot of back and forth and disagreement with the mobile community and some folks with the FCC that are not interested in keeping the rules the way they are until we try to turn them around. So I think, you know, February is probably a pretty good guess at this point.
Thank you. What does it take to get into the CAF?
Oh, we one of our presenters, Ted Osborne. If people need his email address, we can do that. He has a nice package that can help you understand that. So CAF is a process that you follow and apply for. And Ted can help you through that. He's one of our invited speakers for the seminar, so he will be at the Miami seminar. But if you need
We're losing you
his
again.
name, and he lives in Colorado. Oh, Ted, it's Ted Osborne.
Okay.
Hey, Dory, let me jump into, because the CAF auction rules is something that I've been spending a lot of time on. So to answer the question a little bit, the FCC is still working through what the auction rules are going to be. Again, we think that's going to be something they're going to decide in early part of 2018, and we may see an auction sometime during 2018. It'll be a reverse auction. There's a lot of complexity to it, but it involves making cost-effective bids, but it also has a speed and latency and usage component to it that weights your bid. So basically, the faster the speed that you propose, the more credit you're going to get at the auction. And there'll be auction by census block groups, and there's a fairly detailed short form application that is designed to keep applicants accountable. And again, Ted can speak to you about that as well as I can, but it's a much longer conversation.
Someone's asking about what does it take? You mentioned earlier about some hands-on tech support, and what does it take to get that?
We have two things. We have Zendesk, so you can send a trouble ticket in, and then we've got people that are assigned to the accounts. So when you have an account, you've got a person that, especially when you're just getting started, that is your lifeline to getting up and running.
And are there fees associated?
Not initially, but then there is a service level agreement that is extremely low priced for what you get and for what we do to provide support during the course of the year and provide things like software updates and such.
Where can we find documentation on the product, including guidelines when selecting different components and their capabilities? Is there publicly available information to this regard?
I think the best thing to do there would be to talk to one of our salespeople to get you then to a sales engineer to get those documents and have a conversation with them. I don't have those documents, but they've got to exist. And so the best thing to do, if Nick were here, he'd tell us exactly. So I'm sorry that he was pulled away, but I think
all
that's
of
the
the spec
easiest way.
sheets are available on telrad.com, but of course, very often you'll need additional information to understand how to best apply to your specific application. So I would say to contact one of the salespeople would probably be your best bet to get any specific answers.
And they can send us a note during, we'll get it to the right people or get it to Nick. Happy to do that.
What is the best way to handle low CINR due to increasing density of large carrier deployments?
We need Nick Dewar for that. And when you say large carrier deployments, I don't know if you mean a competitive offering or if you're looking at creating self-interference. Self-interference is something that you specifically design. Your network planning is critical to making sure that you end up with high SINR, so you get the best throughput. So that's within your control. The stuff that's out of your control is if there's some sort of interferer from another type of device that's operating near the band and maybe creating different types of interference that would cause a SINR problem. But many of those are going to be, well, what else is operating at 365? And fortunately, at 365, it's very different because you don't have other types of interferers like you do at 700. So 700, you end up with TV stations and other things that provide bleed into the mobile network, which is a challenge for companies like AT&T and Verizon. But in our case, I think it's good network planning is your first tool. And second is to then understand, is there any other operators that are operating too close to your frequency with products that are giving off, they're not performing, their filters are not performing the function of a filter.
How long is the training that's conducted in Kentucky?
Dory, is that 3 days?
It is 3 days.
3 days, okay.
And yeah, the last question clarified that they meant other LTE deployments in the 3.65 band.
I'm sorry, say that again.
There was a follow-up to clarify for the last question. They were speaking specifically of LTE deployments in the 3.65 band.
Yeah, okay. Okay, then yeah, that interference is really, network planning is the thing you have to get right.
Okay, I think we have gotten to the end of the questions.
Oh, and I think there was still 55 people that stuck here till the end. So really appreciate it, everybody. If you've got additional questions or comments, concerns, or want to get into something, that's our job to do that. And we'd love to help out and answer your questions and make sure that we're clear about them. So any additional feedback you can send to me, tom.gruba, Gruba, at telrad.com. And other than that, have a great day and a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Yeah, we appreciate all you being here, and we will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the presentation, and we will also have a short survey that we would really be grateful if you completed to give us some feedback. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you all next time.
And thank you, Steve, so much for being here. It was awesome.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. Thanks, Tori.
You bet.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Happy holidays. Okay, bye now.